Alright, what's up guys? In this video I'm going to show you how to reach 100% reduced elemental damage taken from hits in the ongoing Phrecia Trial of the Ancestors event. I didn't personally play this event because it's only 3 weeks, but that doesn't stop us from theory crafting. One important distinction before we get into this is that reduced damage taken and damage reduction are two different modifiers. So damage reduction, like physical and elemental damage reduction that you can get from endurance charges, stacks only up to 90%, but reduced damage taken is a modifier that can stack actually up to 100%. Here on this slide are listed all of the sources of reduced damage taken. They are primarily reduced elemental damage taken mods, not many that are global modifiers. The first one is Self-Chill, which has a base of 30% and can be elevated to 40% with Shaper of Winter. Self-Chill can be applied in one of two ways usually. The first is with the Fulcrum Staff and reflecting chills back to yourself, which allows you to have 30 to 40% reduced damage taken across all damage types. The other method is using Bone Chill, Ice Fang Orbit, and Golden Rule to reflect poisons back to yourself that have a chill effect tied to it, and that allows you to achieve 30 to 40% reduced cold damage taken specifically. The next one is Nebulock, which gives 1% reduced elemental damage taken per endurance charge. If you use 2 Nebulocks, then you get 2% per endurance charge. Then you have Wise Oak, which gives a 6% base reduced elemental damage taken, which can be scaled by Flask Effect. Soul of Lunaris, which gives 6% reduced elemental damage taken if you've been hit recently. Soul of Solaris gives 8%, but if you haven't been hit recently. Gorgon's Gaze gives 5% reduced elemental damage taken if you are stationary. This can be elevated to 6% with a volatile Vol Orb. Essence of Horror Boots give 5% reduced elemental damage taken also when stationary. And lastly, Corrupted Body Armor can give 6% of one of the elemental damage types, so either fire, cold, or lightning. And then you finally have the ascendancies to choose from. Herald gives 25%, Harbinger 20%, which can also come from the Immortal Will Shield. Saboteur gives 15%, Polytheist and Slayer can give 10% respectively. And going back to the Fulcrum use case, Surfcaster and Scavenger are great ascendancies for use of the Fulcrum, but as you can see from my next slide, the ones in yellow are the ones I've personally selected as the best way to achieve 100% reduced elemental damage taken. And the reason for that is a large amount can come from the Nebulock bases, and you aren't really able to use them with Fulcrum. One, Fulcrum being a staff, and if you use the Scavenger Ascendancy, you have to use, I'm going to say this wrong, but Ahuana's Bite, Quiver, and as you know, a Nebulock cannot be used with a quiver. So the easiest way to achieve 100% reduced elemental damage taken is with these mods in yellow. I do also want to call out Harbinger here that I've put in red. The issue with Harbinger is that it will make you immune to elemental ailments, which prevents you from using Self-Chill, which is a very big source of reduced damage taken. There is actually a way to reach 100% with Harbinger, but it requires that you basically get all of the mods here, including, the Corrupted Body Armor and the stationary mods from Gorgon's Gaze and Essence of Horror Boots. So the playstyle ends up being very restrictive because you also have to use a channeling skill in order for the Harbinger to cast the buff on the player that gives the 20% reduced damage taken. Also notice that I didn't include Kongming's Stratagem Shield on this slide. It gives 30% reduced spell damage taken from blinded enemies and up to 37% if you have a perfect volatile Vol Orb. I just thought it was not a very reliable source because it only applies to spell damage, so I left it out. So with the Herald Ascendancy, this is one way you can achieve 100% reduced elemental damage taken from hits. You get 40% from Self-Chill, and since we're using dual Nebulocks, this has to be using the Bone Chill method instead of Fulcrum. So this is 40% reduced cold damage taken specifically. You get 25% from Damnation, which is a specific Herald ascendancy that reads, for each element you've been hit by damage of recently, you get 25% reduced damage taken of that element. So it requires some self-hit mechanic ideally. You have dual Nebulox with 10 endurance charges that would be 20% reduced elemental damage taken. You can get 10% from Wise Oak if you have at least 67% flask effect. I'll get into that a little bit more later. Finally, 6% from Soul of Lunaris, which requires you to be hit, which pairs well with Damnation because both of them do well with self-hit mechanics. So this totals 101%. The reason for choosing some of these is because I find them more reliable sources of reduced damage taken. It's not reliant on blinding enemies, it's not reliant on being stationary, and ultimately I think the dual Nebulox make a lot of sense because you also need to scale your physical defenses, and one way to do that is through endurance charges. There's no point really getting extremely tanky on the elemental side if you fall over from physical damage. So I think with this package it makes a lot of sense, and you get defenses for both physical and elemental. And with CI, you can be immune to chaos damage as well. Right, this is the POB that I put together. As mentioned, we're using the Herald Phrecia Ascendancy, which has this node Damnation. It's the highest reduced damage taken that is available from the Phrecia Ascendancies, and it's probably easiest to review the items first. The first mechanic we're using to get reduced damage taken is Self-Chill, which uses a combination of items and interactions. You need 2 rings, Winterweave and Icefang Orbit, as well as the Golden Rule and Bone Chill support on one of your skills. The quick and dirty explanation is that Icefang Orbit has this line, non-chilled enemies you poison are chilled. So when you poison an enemy, they get chilled, and Golden Rule reflects that poison back to yourself. That poison is going to carry that chill effect back to you, and Winterweave is going to reverse the effect of that chill so that instead of reducing your action speed and increasing the cold damage you take because of Bone Chill support, it actually increases your action speed by up to 40% with Shaper of Winter, and up to 40% reduced cold damage taken also because of Shaper of Winter. So we get 40% from Self-Chill, 25% from Damnation, we get 20% from dual-wielding Nebulox. Each of these gives 10% reduced elemental damage taken from hits if you're running 10 endurance charges. We get 6% from Soul of Lunaris and 10% from Wise Oak. At its base, it gives 6% reduced damage taken of each element, but if you scale up the flask effect by at least 67%, it's going to have a value of 10% instead. All of this together adds up to 101% reduced damage taken, or more specifically, 101% reduced cold damage taken, because the self Bone Chill effect is only for cold damage. So the next thing we do is convert all of our elemental damage taken to cold damage. The way to do that is using Sublime Vision, which converts 30% of fire and lightning damage taken to cold damage, Watcher's Eye, which converts another 20%, and we get the remaining amount from Taste of Hate, which converts 30% at its base, but with 67% flask effect, it also has a value of 50%. So in total, that is 100% of fire and lightning damage from hits taken as cold damage. That's why this whole time I've been saying we can achieve 100% reduced elemental damage from hits, but not necessarily dot effects. And this is why, even though we only need 9% reduced damage taken from Wise Oak to achieve 100% reduced cold damage taken, because Taste of Hate needs 67% flask effect, we end up overshooting Wise Oak by 1%, and that's why we have 101% reduced damage taken instead. One more thing to note about Self-Chill is that the chill effect from Icefang Orbit only has a base chill effect of 10%, so you need to find ways to increase that to 40%. One way to do that is using Olesia's Delight, which allows you to gain affliction charges. Each affliction charge gives you 8% more effective non-damaging ailments, so with 10 affliction charges, that's 80% more effect. You can get additional chill effect from some other sources. As you can see here in the chill effect mod section, 50% is coming from Retribution, which is the 4th ascendancy point in Herald, 45% from Bone Chill, 15% from Calamitous, which is coming from a cluster jewel, and 20% from the passive tree. As long as your chill effect multiplier is 4 or higher, you should be getting a 40% reduced cold damage taken. Okay, talking about charges, we're not stacking endurance charges directly. We're using Replica Badge of the Brotherhood so that we can stack maximum frenzy charges, and in turn that increases our maximum endurance charges. In the Calcs tab, you can see where we get these frenzy charges. We have 3 base. We get 2 from the tree, Fervor and Frenetic. Unfortunately, since we have a Witch start, it's hard to reach the last one, Savagery, in the Duelist side of the tree. We get 1 from Honored Tattoo of the Barbarian, which is one of the Phrecia legacy tattoos, 1 from Alessia's Delight, and 1 from an influenced pair of gloves. I forget which influence it is, but one of them gives +1 max frenzy charges. You'll also see that there's a +2 here, custom modifier. If we go to the config tab, you'll see it here. Basically, I'm using a Forbidden Tattoo of the Shadow to get Swift Killer, which gives +2 maximum frenzy charges. And that goes on... that goes on Coming Calamity, because this one disables your aura skills, and we can't have that because we're using Sublime Vision and Watcher's Eye with Purity of Ice. One other note about charges is that we're using Ralakesh's Impatience to ensure that we're always at max frenzy charges, which also ensures that we're always at max endurance charges. We still need a way to gain affliction charges, which is why we're using Frenzy of Onslaught as an easy source of frenzy charges to get our chill effect. Going back to Damnation, in order to proc this reliably, we need to be taking damage of these elements recently, and since we're converting all of the damage we take to cold damage specifically, the only one we're concerned with here is taking cold damage recently. And the most reliable way to do that is probably with a self-hit mechanic. Since we're using Frenzy of Onslaught, which is a strike, and we're using Nebulocks, which are maces, we are able to use Trauma. So the Trauma support gem, which basically hits us for a small amount of physical damage. If we have a source of damage taken as cold, which we get from this body armor, then some of the damage we take from Trauma is going to be cold damage, which allows us to proc Damnation reliably. This also pairs well with Soul of Lunaris, which has 6% reduced elemental damage taken if you have been hit recently. So Trauma alone solves 31% of our reduced damage taken. Okay, for solving for physical defenses, I just went with scaling physical damage reduction up to 90%, which is the cap. You get 40% from scaling endurance charges, 15% from being affected by Herald of Purity, which comes from the future guilt ascendancy from the Herald, 8% from your chest, 5% from Soul of Gruthkol, which requires you to be hit recently, which is solved by Trauma, and 10% from the Militant Faith Timeless Jewel. I also added 1% from Soul of Lunaris if you're facing only one enemy. And there's 2 custom modifiers here, 6% and 5%. I go to the custom modifier section, 5% comes from Perfect Guardian Turtle, and 6% comes from the mod from the Watcher's Eye, which says 6% additional physical damage reduction while affected by Determination. And this doesn't work in POB because we're using Sublime Vision Purity of Ice, so that's why it's in the custom mods. A couple other defenses we can use are Arctic Armor, which has this modifier, less physical damage taken from hits while stationary. Sigil of Power, which has enemies in area deal % less damage while at maximum stages. And Steel Skin, which takes some of the damage from the buff before life or ES. It's also our only source of immunity to bleeding. Technically, even if Steel Skin is on cooldown, since we have 90% PDR, bleeds shouldn't do much damage at all. But if we deselect all of these like this, we do end up with a much lower Fizz max hit, which is kind of unfortunate, but hopefully it's okay to handle most content. One last thing I'll note about physical defenses is that I have tattooed over this keystone with Divine Shield. It's one of the legacy tattoos in the Phrecia event where you can get a random keystone over another keystone. So this is definitely like a nice to have. And I think while we're in this area, I should mention how we actually get Flask Effect. So this gives 100% increased effective tattoos in radius. and we are able to tattoo 3 places with flasks applied to you have 8% increased effect. Here, here, and here. The only way you can allocate these is if you have 7 adjacent passives. So it is a lot of points allocated, and that gives you 48% flask effect. And you get the remaining 20% or so from nodes down here. Talking about issues with this build, the most glaring issue is how to activate the Wise Oak, which has this line, reduced damage taken of each element for which your uncapped elemental resistance is lowest, which means your cold resistance has to be lowest if all of our elemental damage is being taken as cold. The issue with that is many of our unique items have cold resistance: Winterweave, Alessia's Delight, Taste of Hate, Ralakesh's Impatience. You're also using Purity of Ice. So you end up with so much cold resistance, and you only have a few rare gear pieces to put fire and lightning resistance. So you can see here that I actually used the max roll on all of these resistances, in addition to using Ruby and Topaz Flask. And that gets us to an equal amount of resistances. So it's a very large investment there, and I think it's the most awkward part of the build. There's an extreme suffix pressure because you also need to get strength from some of your gear pieces to use Nebulocks, which require 212 strength, and you also need accuracy because you can't use precision because you're using Purity of Ice, Sublime Vision. So this is definitely the most weird part, and I think there is a very good argument to not use Militant Faith. Instead of getting the last 5% PDR, which is coming from here, and I believe somewhere here, yeah, 10%. It might make a lot more sense to go with Supreme Ostentation from Elegant Hubris, so that you can just tattoo your entire tree and not worry about attributes. That definitely relieves some of the suffix pressure and allows you to get rid of these strength rolls and add a little bit more resistance if you need it. Not having to worry about attributes also allows us to use the Lich Circlet Helmet, which has a requirement of 224 int, and as you can see here, we only have 176 int. And since we're only running with less than 3k ES, any additional ES from the helmet goes a long way. The other major issue is that the constant damage over time that you take from Nebulocks is partially unsolved. Since we are running 2 of these and we're running 10 endurance charges, that's 4,000 fire damage per second. You can see here the total degen is less than 200 because we have a lot of mitigation. Divine Shield definitely helps as well if you have the tattoo, but in maps I think it shouldn't be an issue, but if you're in like a boss fight with invulnerability phases, it might pose a problem. You might have to just solve it by using like a weapon swap to get off the Nebulocks for a little bit, and then weapon swap back once you can attack something. The Writhing Jar might help a tiny bit. This is mostly used to proc Elemental Conflicts from the Retribution node. Ideally, you can mitigate fire damage further with 10% of elemental damage taken as chaos damage if 4 hunter items are equipped. This applies to damage over time effects. The only unfortunate part is that it's really hard to do in a Phrecia TotA event. There's just a very small supply of the influenced uniques that you need. Anyway, this is the Herald POB that I put together. It's the best build that I could come up with all of the various restrictions, like using the Nebulocks and so on. I tried some other attacks and spells, but Frenzy of Onslaught ended up making the most sense, but totally possible there are some better DPS options that I overlooked. But considering we went all in on defenses, this looks pretty respectable. Again, the real point of this is to just tank infinite elemental damage from hits and also have decent tankiness on the physical side. Okay, you might be wondering, is this possible outside of the Phrecia TotA event? Technically, it is. You don't need Forbidden Tattoos, you don't need the Phrecia Ascendancies. It's just really, really awkward to do so. You will need to be a Saboteur or Trickster. You will get 30% reduced damage taken from Self-Chill using the Bone Chill method. You're going to have to run dual Nebulocks, this time with 11 Frenzy charges, which translate to 11 Endurance charges, 15% from Born in the Shadows, so you'll need to find a way to blind the whole screen, 10% from Wise Oak, 6% Soul of Lunaris, 6% from the corrupted body armor. This is like the 6% reduced cold damage taken mod, 6% from Gorgon's Gaze if you volatile Vol Orbit, 5% from Essence of Horror Boots. So this all means you have to remain stationary as well. And I think in this case you won't be able to use Alessia's Delight because you will need to use the micro distillery belt to replace the flask effect that you lost from not having access to the flask effect tattoos and Warrior's Tale. So you lose 2 frenzy charges from not having Alessia's Delight and also the Honored tattoo of the Barbarian, but you do replace it with 3 frenzy charges at the very top end. Can get an extra one from the tree. As mentioned before, since we were a witch start, it was hard to get the last one in the duelist side, but if you're a saboteur / trickster, you should be able to get that last one in the duelist tree, get an extra frenzy charge with a corruption on your gloves, and one from Bound by Destiny if you're wearing 6 Redeemer influenced items, which is possible if you use your body armor, gloves, boots, 2 rings, and belt slot for the 6 Redeemer items. But again, this has a lot of issues. You're not able to use Ralakesh's Impatience, so you need a really good, reliable way to generate charges. You have to be stationary, you need a corrupted body armor while still getting high ES, because that's mainly where we're getting our ES from, and you need to blind the entire screen. So that limits options a lot, and hopefully we see some new options in 3.29 that allow this to happen, but I don't think it's worth the effort. If you're interested in making a POB for this, I would just use the Phrecia template POB and adapt it to just like a regular Ascendancy. Anyway, hope I succeeded in just showing what's possible when it comes to reduced damage taken. Is it overkill? Is it worth doing? I'll let you guys decide for yourself how you want to approach that. Anyway, I do have another video that should come out soon of an actual build that I made in Mirage. So please subscribe to get notified about that. It's not as broken in the same way as my Forbidden Turtle tech, which literally made you immortal, but I'd say it's probably unintended and should be quite interesting. Look out for that video. See you guys in 3.29. Thanks.